Hey everybody. Want to say thank you for inviting me to join this year's SAPIX conference. Hello to all of my colleagues throughout Africa and throughout the world who are able to join virtually. What I wanted to share this year is really kind of my thought process about one of the big challenges that I see for all of us as we look at supply chains and as we deal with the range of disruptions that have really been hitting us over the last year and a half or so. And for me, I think the really important thing that it highlights is the importance of aligning supply with demand with consumption. And doing it not just in a quantitative way, which has been, the focus for a long time with the efforts we're making in artificial intelligence and analytics, but kind of going back to the basics and thinking about qualitative analysis and trying to get a sense for what these disruptions look like and how we can, in real time, start to anticipate how they are likely to affect us in the near term and over the long term. So, to set up that discussion, I think a good place to start is for all of us to try to remember the world back in 2019. And back in 2019, when we talked about a supply chain disruption, we'd describe it this way, right? It was like, the supply chain is a pond, and a disruption is when you throw a stone into the pond. And when that stone lands, it creates these ripples. And the ripples go out and they affect other parts of the supply chain, right? And those ripples can propagate for a while. And so you really have to think about all the different ways that, those ripples could spread and realize that it's going to take a little while for that to resolve. So that was what we thought about supply chain disruptions a few years ago. If you look at what's happened in the last year and a half, this is really what our supply chain disruptions have looked like. So the key here is it's more than just throwing a stone into the pond. We're blowing the pond up, and we're doing it over and over again. And that's creating these enormous ripples that go far beyond anything that we would have expected or imagined before. And what that means is supply chain, folks, is we really need to think bigger and more broadly about the scope of these challenges and the impacts they're likely to have. So, in case you don't know me, my name is Daniel, but everybody calls me Mr. Supply Chain. I teach supply chain and project management courses on LinkedIn Learning. I'm the author of Supply Chain Management for Dummies, as well as a couple of smaller books, Supply Chain Planning for Dummies, Supply Chain Risk Management for Dummies, and I've done a bit of other writing. I'm a professor of supply chain management at Bradley University, and I'm a doctoral student at Cranfield University in the UK. So the thing that I would say, just as a setup to the conversation, is that we know that there are properties and behaviors of supply chains that we can predict, that we understand. We see them over and over again. And we can use that knowledge of the past to analyze the events that are happening around us and anticipate likely outcomes, right? So we may not know for sure, but we can guess pretty well. So our knowledge of the future isn't perfect, but we can make educated guesses and balance our business goals against the needs and expectations of our customers and and the communities that we serve. And that's really what I want to be thinking about in this talk. So here's our agenda. We're going to start talking about supply chains, the role of variation, dig down a little bit into disruptions, and in particular, talk about the phenomenon of the bullwhip effect. What does it take to get back to steady state? And then we'll dissect a handful of examples from the last 2 years, and then talk about, what strategies can we be employing going forward to try to make our supply chains more resilient. Okay, so first, what is a supply chain? Now, there are different definitions of supply chains out there, so I want to lead with my definition from Supply Chain Management for Dummies. I define a supply chain as a complex system made up of people, processes, and technologies that's engineered and managed to deliver something of value to a customer. So, the image that many of us use and that comes to mind for me is the beer game, which is the classic way that we teach supply chain students about the relationships between the participants in a supply chain. Orders flow upstream, products flow downstream, information flows both ways. And we can actually model that system and predict some behaviors. One of the things that we see all the time in supply chains is variation, right? So, in this case, I'm looking specifically at demand or orders. When customers place an order, it varies. It's not constant over time. And so if we think about that in relation to the minimum inventory that we hold, as long as our orders are below our minimum inventory, well, there's no problem. We have 100% service level. We can, meet the expectations of our customers. Where we start to run into trouble is when the orders exceed our inventory level, right? Then we have a stock out. And the greater the difference between the orders, the demand, and our inventory level, the more severe those stockouts become, right? Because then we get into a back order situation, then we may lose customers, or we may end up with problems like phantom orders, where customers start ordering from different suppliers without the expectation that they're actually going to complete all of those orders, right? They may place an order and then cancel it later on. So we get that sort of gaming or those phantom orders. So a couple of key points about variation. So one is small variations can generally be absorbed by a system, right? We have shock absorbers built into our supply chains. Inventory is a shock absorber. Expedited transportation is a shock absorber. And really, supply chain collaboration can be a shock absorber, right? You may be able to talk to your customers and get them to lower their orders so it isn't actually as much of a demand and as much of a strain on your supply chain. Or you may be able to work with your suppliers to get some additional material to meet an order. So collaboration really can act as a shock absorber. Another key point about variation, we talk in supply chain a lot about process improvement methodologies like Lean and Six Sigma and the theory of constraints. And people often think about those sort of process improvement methods as being a way of reducing inventory. But one of the things that I think is important to point out is actually what those approaches tend to do is to reduce the amount of variability. And by reducing the amount of variability, you reduce the amount of inventory that you need to have as a buffer to be able to handle the variation that comes in. You can be more reliable with less inventory because you have less variation. So what that means is you can reduce your inventory if you reduce the variation, and that's a benefit to the supply chain. But it also means that supply chains can be more fragile and less able to respond when a variation does occur. Okay. So when we talk about a supply chain disruption, really it's generally one of two things. Either you have a greater demand than what you have supply or inventory, so then we have a stockout or a backorder situation, or on the flip side, we can find situations where the demand drops off, but we're still sitting on inventory, right? And so that's kind of a collapse of our demand, which results in overstock. It means we've got material that we can't use. And we really need to think about both of those because they can have impacts on the business. Really, I guess the point here is that above a certain threshold, the variance actually becomes a disruption. So below a certain threshold, a variance is just a behavior that the supply chain can absorb. When you get beyond the ability of or the capacity for the supply chain to absorb the variation, that's when we hit a disruption. So, if the issue with a disruption is that you don't have enough supply, what can you do about it? Well, you've got some options. There are some strategies you can adopt. You can look for alternate suppliers, right? Find someplace else to buy it. You can use substitution. Find something else that you could use instead of the thing that you're trying to order and you don't have enough of. Or you can conserve, right? Look for ways to use less of whatever it is. Those are all good strategies to deal with a shortage, right? When you can't get the things that you want. When we have an increase in demand, other things that we can do are we can increase our capacity, right? Increase the output. We may need to allocate production and say, okay, instead of making everything, we're only going to make a few things so that we lose less capacity and changeover. Or instead of serving all customers, we're going to dedicate or allocate our production to just a few key customers to make sure that they're getting what they need. And maybe we ignore the rest or make a choice to not provide the others with as much as they've ordered. Another strategy for dealing with an increase in demand, of course, is to increase prices, right? Because we have these price demand curves where, at a dollar a piece, maybe you have 1,000 people that want to buy it, but if you increase the price to $5, now you've got fewer customers that you need to serve. You're able to reduce the demand, fill that demand, and increase your profits. So those are all common strategies, things that we do to try to deal with situations where we have more demand than we have supply. On the flip side, when demand drops off and we still have inventory or we still have capacity in our supply chain, what are things that we can do then? Well, maybe we cut production, right? Maybe we stop making things and stop shipping things so that we don't dig a deeper hole. In some cases, maybe it's okay. Maybe we just stockpile. Say, all right, the demand has gone away for today, but we think it's going to come back at some point in the near future, and we need to be ready to meet it. So we're just going to stockpile in the meantime. Another option is to discount, to lower the prices, because that of course should increase your demand. And then the last option is to scrap inventory, to just say, listen, we've got it. We don't think we're going to be able to sell it. It may go, it may be spoiled or go to waste, and so maybe we give it away or we sell it for whatever we can get in a scrap market. So those are all strategies for dealing with a situation where you've got supply, but the demand has disappeared. Now, when you have disruptions, right, which we're defining as a variation that exceeds the capacity of the system to absorb it, one of the things that happens, and we know this in supply chains, is it triggers a bullwhip effect, right? So wherever the disruption occurs, as those ripples move around in the pond, not only do they affect more and more of our supply chain partners, but they tend to get amplified the further away they move. This graph does a really good job of showing how, and this is from the beer game, showing how a small change in demand by a customer gets amplified and it gets shifted in time so that the warehouse sees a bigger change, the distribution center sees an even bigger one, and the plant, the supplier, the brewery sees a massive swing in the orders, right? Goes from, a really low level of orders to a really high level of orders and then back again. And that's that bullwhip. So the more significant the disruption, the greater the amplitude that we expect to see in the bullwhip, and the longer we expect to see it propagating through the supply chain. So the truth is, these things are so complex that they're really hard to predict and measure precisely. But we can do some things to model them using system dynamics to give us a pretty good sense of how they're going to behave. And if you do that modeling, you start to develop a qualitative sense. You can begin to predict what's going to happen in the real world without even necessarily needing to run the model, right? And that's where experience and judgment really become valuable. So, the key to getting back to normal, to returning to steady state, is we want to get to the place where supply is more or less equal to demand, and where demand, which is the orders, the amount people are buying, is more or less equal to consumption, which is the amount people are using. And this really gets to the heart of why I think this is an important conversation, because what I've seen a lot, really emphasized in the last couple of years, is that in the supply chain world, we tend to talk about supply and demand, and we imply that demand and consumption are the same thing. But in reality, they're not. Demand is how much is being purchased, how much people are ordering. Consumption is how much people are actually using. And it turns out those don't really line up all the time. And when those get out of sync, that actually becomes a trigger for the bullwhip effect. So, we'll talk about this a little bit more, and I'm going to give a bunch of examples, but some key points here. Once a bullwhip starts, it takes time to return to steady state. It actually ripples back and forth through the supply chain. So once a bullwhip starts, you'll see, for these swings from stockouts to stockpiling for a while, right? And in the same place. So a warehouse may be completely out of stock at one point, and then you turn around and they're overflowing with inventory, and then it'll flip again as that bullwhip ripples back and forth. The longer the supply chain and the more complex it is, the longer we would expect to see these bullwhips persist. And so the key to understanding when it's going to start to even out is really thinking about supply and demand and consumption. One last point that I'll make here is that demand is about orders. And so it's really how much people are buying. People don't just buy what they're using. Their buying patterns are also driven by emotion, fear, and greed. And demand, or their buying patterns, can be affected by things like seasonality and inflation and, economics, recessions, or boom-bust cycles. So all of those factors, along with consumption, tie into demand, right? And can actually kind of distort the signals in a supply chain. So let's look at some examples. So the first example I want to look at is one that we all lived through, which was toilet paper. But let's think about what happened with the toilet paper crisis in terms of supply and demand and consumption. And I'll point out that, if we were using this logic in, what was that, March, April of 2020, then the whole situation made a whole lot of sense, and we could make better decisions both as consumers and as supply chain professionals about how to respond to it. So what happened to the supply for toilet paper? Nothing. Nothing at all. The supply didn't change basically anywhere in the world. The factories were still running, more or less the trucks were still running. The demand for toilet paper went up, right? Because that is a relatively stable supply chain that runs at a steady state and doesn't have a lot of extra capacity, a relatively small variation in demand was enough to cause a disruption, right? To create a stock out and then back orders. And what that drove was a further increase in demand. The key, though, is that the consumption didn't actually change at the end of the supply chain. So the supply was more or less stable. The consumption was more or less stable. The demand spiked, which led to a disruption. You've got to, at the time, if we would have thought about it, we would have said, okay, so what's happening is the inventory is moving downstream in the supply chain, and it's building up there, it's stockpiling there. So in this case, that was our cupboards and our garages that people were just stockpiling toilet paper, and as a result, their upstream supply chain partners, the stores and the factories, couldn't keep up with the demand. But like we said, consumption wasn't changing. So what would you expect to happen in that supply chain? Well, at some point, the consumers can't store any more toilet paper, right? Their warehouse at home is full. At some point, the fear and the greed dissipate, and now I've got so much toilet paper, I don't know what to do with it. So how long is it going to be before I buy toilet paper again from the store? So what happens now is my orders to the store went way up for a short period of time, and now they're going to go way down for a long period of time. The question then for the upstream folks in the supply chain is, well, how do we respond to this, right? Do we invest in additional manufacturing and transportation capacity for toilet paper in response to this demand signal? Well, if we're only looking at the demand signal and we're trying to be responsive to it, we might. But if we're actually looking at consumption, then we know that this is a short-term effect. It will pass eventually, and investing in more supply, investing in more capacity when the consumption isn't actually going up will be a bad investment over the long term. And in fact, what we could expect is that at some point, once the downstream demand starts to drop off, then we're going to start seeing those other behaviors of discounting and scrapping excess inventory because there's just more than what's needed there. Okay, so that was the first example. The second example was masks, gloves, hand sanitizers, and disinfecting wipes. And if you looked at a lot of the news stories, you'd see these things lumped together with toilet paper, right? We were stocked out of toilet paper and disinfecting wipes. But the difference here is that it's fundamentally a different behavior in the supply chain. Yeah, the supply was flat, right? We didn't really have, at least not instantly, a lot more production and supply chain capacity for disinfecting wipes. But the demand, of course, spiked, but the consumption actually went up. And from what I can see, the consumption has stayed higher. We are doing more disinfecting, more cleaning now than we were 2 years ago. So in this situation, really, it's a different approach. And this is a place where you look at it and you say, oh, consumption has increased and demand has increased. In this case, we really need to increase supply, right? We need to scale up our capacity to meet this new level of demand. So the good news is this is one where sort of the natural reaction of they're buying more, let's invest so we can make more, is going to pay off. But there's also a challenge here, which is we know that the consumption has increased, but we don't actually know how much it's increased. We don't know what the new steady state level of consumption will be. And the only way that we're going to find that is by building more capacity than what is actually needed, right? So we're going to see stockouts and shortages until we get to the place that we overshoot demand. And at that point, we've invested too much. And, you know, from the supply side, we're going to see that issue of, oh, now we've got overstocks. Now we need to start scaling back capacity. Now we may have to scrap some inventory because people aren't buying as much as we're making. But until we get to that point, until we start to see those signals that the supply chain is saturated, we can continue investing and building because the supply has not yet caught up with consumption, the new level of consumption. Because we know that at some point, even though capacity has gone up or consumption has gone up, so we need to increase the capacity for the supply chain, we know that at some point we're going to overshoot consumption. And so one of the things to think about is how do we build that capacity, but do it flexibly so that when we reach that point where we've overshot the consumption, we can scale back without being committed to infrastructure and investments that are just more than what's needed in the marketplace. Because the presumption is, you know, we will get to a new steady state, and that's what we're trying to get to once supply is able to equal consumption. All right, so here's a third example, which is anything having to do with the sports hospitality and entertainment industry. Well, in this case, we had a rapid decrease in demand and a decrease in consumption, right? We shut down stadiums, we shut down restaurants. So the demand and the consumption both disappeared. But these supply chains already had inventory in place and they had stuff in the pipeline. They had more coming. And a lot of it was perishable, right? So, of course, you know, you've got perishable food, but you also have, you know, perishable merchandise like logo jerseys for team players and, you know, anything that has the year on it. It's perishable. It loses its value if it's not consumed or if it's not sold in a relatively quick period of time. So, you know, now we've got this issue that consumption has gone away, demand has gone away. We have a supply chain pushing material through that could be obsolete. What should we be doing with that? And we talked earlier about, you know, we could stockpile it for things that aren't perishable. That may make sense, right? You just hang on to it because it may be better to stockpile than to cancel orders and then try to restart the supply chain later, especially if you don't know how long it's going to last. But for things that were perishable, really the smart move was just to donate it, just to get rid of it, just sell it for what you could get. If the stadium got shut down and you had a bunch of food that was going to go bad, donate it to a homeless shelter, right? Find ways of getting it out to people that'll use it, because you're not going to be able to sell it, and you don't, you're making the problem worse if you're having to carry the cost of holding that inventory instead of just getting it someplace that it can be used. We did see this in some places where restaurants, for example, donated their food to folks in the community. Then there's the question about going forward, for the orders that you have or that you were planning to place. Do you cancel them? Do you postpone them? Or do you just go ahead with it? There's another issue that a lot of companies struggled with, which was, well, can we invoke force majeure and just say this is an act of God, and so we want to walk away with this contract and be held harmless? The truth is, in the short term, those can be helpful tactics, and there are places where it probably is the right thing to do, and it makes sense. But in the long term, that can have a really negative impact on a relationship. And, you could find yourself in a place that you've now lost a customer or lost a supplier over the long term because of a decision that you made in the short term to try and respond to a disruption. So there are some options there, but I think that the key thing is, in this event of a catastrophic disruption where demand and consumption both go away and you're dealing with a perishable product, scrapping it, donating it quickly is probably the smart move, and then slowing down the supply chain as much as you can to buy yourself time to figure out what's going to happen. All right, then the fourth example I wanted to look at is, the stuff that really we're still dealing with in a very big way today, which are supply disruptions, right? And so using this model of supply, demand, and consumption, what we're seeing in lots of scenarios is that the supply is down for some reason. It's interrupted. There's a lack of materials, or it's hard to get things because of transportation problems. But the demand and the consumption are flat, or even in some cases really increasing, right, as things start to open back up. Some extreme examples of this are, right now in the U.S., almost unheard of, air cargo, air freight is priced more or less competitively with ocean freight. It is so hard, so expensive to move material from China to the U.S. right now. And we've built up air capacity sort of over the last, year as we've recovered from COVID. So, now it may make more sense to just put stuff on an airplane rather than trying to get a booking on a container, on a container ship. So these are all, different forms of supply disruption. So, one is the transportation piece. Other things that we've seen just in the last few months, of course, COVID lockdowns, which are affecting different parts of the world. The microchip shortages, which are affecting lots of industries. We hear a lot about what's happening in the automotive industry. Trade disputes and things like Brexit are interrupting supply flows. In the U.S., we had a cyber attack on an oil pipeline that serves a part of the country that I live in. We had a blizzard in Texas, which shut down a lot of production of chemicals that are critical for manufacturing industries. When we look at those disruptions, one of the ways that one of the lenses that I use is an approach that Richard Wilding at Cranfield University introduced, where he talks about three things that contribute to these interactions. One is sort of the natural presence of chaos in supply chain systems. That, even though we try to organize things and arrange things and plan things out, unexpected things happen. We just end up with a certain amount of chaos that emerges in supply chains. That chaos tends to get amplified, right? Which is what we talk about with the bullwhip effect, how it gets amplified as it spreads. And then the other thing is that we end up with parallel interactions. So, if you have an increase in demand for one item, that may make it hard to ship something else because they're both depending on the same trucks or the same ships. So this combination of chaotic behavior with demand amplification with parallel interactions is just it drives these bullwhips, and it drives a continuation of this chaotic behavior in systems and makes it harder and harder to get back to steady state. And that's where we're at right now, right? So different sort of logic behind it, but we can understand all of these challenges by thinking about supply and demand and consumption and how that's different for different kinds of products in different scenarios. So then the question really comes down to, so what do we do about it? I mean, how can we actually manage the bullwhip effect? Well, one of the things clearly is we need to try to align capacity with demand with consumption. How do we do that? Well, I think supply chain control towers are really the key for a lot of companies to trying to get their arms around that. So at the end of the day, you have to be able to share information. And in order to share information, you need visibility, right? Which means you need to be able to see in your own supply chain what's happening. And you need transparency. You need to be able to show others what's happening in your supply chain, and they need to show to you what's happening in their supply chain. So visibility and transparency are key to information sharing. The other thing that I would say is that flexibility and adaptability are really important too, right? So you've got to be able to see what's going on, but then you have to be able to do something about it. You've got to be able to change and respond. And the sooner that you see an issue, the more options you have to respond, and the less it's going to cost you to do something about it. Another thing that we should be doing to help manage the bullwhip effect is analyzing our supply chain risks, looking at our lot sizes, and positioning inventory strategically. So one of the really interesting stories, specifically around the chip shortage, is that Toyota has been less affected by the shortage than a lot of other automotive companies. And you would think, if Toyota is the grandfather of lean and reducing inventory, wouldn't you expect that Toyota would be the first to feel the hit of a material shortage? But it turns out, back to this idea that lean isn't just about reducing inventory. Lean is really about reducing variability. So Toyota had recognized that chips were a critical part of their supply chain and had taken steps to build in buffers and build in visibility and the ability to collaborate with their suppliers. So they actually were better positioned to deal with the chip shortage than a lot of their competitors. So just in time, first in, first out, Kanban are all really useful approaches for aligning consumption with production. But we also need to think about flexibility and inventory buffers in places where we recognize that there are risks that could have a significant impact on the organization. And then the last strategy that we're talking about a lot right now for managing the bullwhip effect is shortening and simplifying supply chains. So why does this work and how does it work? Because shorter supply chains tend to be more responsive. So the good news and the bad news, you'll feel the impact of a disruption more quickly in a short supply chain, but the bullwhip effect will settle down more quickly too, right? So it'll be a quick short hit instead of a long one that keeps hitting you again and again and again. So the simpler the supply chain, the lower risk of those parallel interactions that Richard Wilding talks about, and the easier it is to get control of the bullwhip. What I will say is nearshoring and regional sourcing really can provide benefits, right? They can reduce the bullwhip effect, you can save money on transportation, you get shorter supply chains, but they're not a cure for all the problems that we run into in supply chains. They may cost more, right? There's a reason that we run supply chains the way that we do, and if you want to change your sourcing locations, you may have to pay more for that. And additionally, they can create new risks. And an example that I like to use is where I live in North Carolina, we don't grow any bananas, right? And we don't grow any avocados. So if you try to source those things locally, either you won't be able to find them, right? So you start to lose access to some of the things that you would want to have as options in your supply chain, or you may get lower quality, or they may be much more expensive. And if the place that I live in suffers from some sort of a disaster, an earthquake or a drought, all of a sudden, if all of my sourcing is local, now the whole region becomes vulnerable. Whereas one of the benefits of global supply chains is we can take advantage of resources that are available in other parts of the world. So we actually become more resilient. One other thing that I'll point out is I think circular supply chains are really an opportunity for us to build models that are more sustainable and more resilient, right? So if we can get to the place that the things that we're using in our supply chains are actually inventory for other supply chains or for our own future supply chains, if we can use the materials that we have on hand as inputs for the future, that can really help to offset some of the risks that we're seeing, some of the challenges that we're seeing with the bullwhip effect and today's long global supply chains. So that's the big message, right? Is how do we get to the place that we're thinking about supply, demand, and consumption and trying to keep all of them aligned. I hope you found that useful. If you're interested in learning more and following me, the best place to do it is LinkedIn. I've got a newsletter up there that you can subscribe to. It's at supplychained.com. It's free, or you can follow me on Mr. Supply Chain on LinkedIn. I'm Mr. Supply Chain. Thank you all very much for joining. I hope that you found this useful, and I hope you have a great conference. Thank you.